The cafe was quiet most nights, especially after the last customer left. The smell of roasted coffee beans still lingered in the air, mixed with the faint sound of raindrops tapping the windows. Behind the counter, a young woman finished wiping the tables. Her name was Lena. She worked there almost every evening from the time the sun dipped behind the hills until the clock ticked close to midnight. Everyone who came to the cafe knew Lena as the quiet one. She never talked much, but her smile was gentle and people liked her for that. She listened more than she spoke, and there was a calmness about her that made others feel at ease. No one really knew much about her life outside of work. They didn't know where she lived or what she did when she went home. To most, she was just the polite girl behind the counter who made good coffee and always remembered their usual order. But when the doors were locked and the lights dimmed low, Lena became someone else. She would walk to the corner of the cafe where an old piano stood, half forgotten by everyone else. Its paint had faded and a few keys stuck when pressed too hard. But to her it wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a friend, one that held all the words she never said out loud. She would sit down on the wooden stool, take a deep breath, and let her fingers rest on the keys. For a few moments she just sat there, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of the night outside. Then without thinking she began to play. Her fingers moved slowly at first as if testing the water of a quiet lake. Then the notes grew stronger, flowing like a story she'd been waiting to tell. The sound filled the room, gentle but deep, echoing off the empty chairs. It was the kind of music that carried emotions words could never explain. Some nights her melodies were soft and full of longing. Other times they were heavy, almost like she was trying to push away her pain through the sound. Lena had been playing since she was a child. Her mother taught her on an old piano they had at home. Back then, music filled their small house. Her mother used to say that every song was a doorway to a memory. But when her mother passed away suddenly, Lena stopped playing altogether. For a long time, she couldn't even look at a piano without feeling that empty space in her chest. Years passed and life became about surviving. She found work at the cafe and stopped thinking about dreams. The piano in the corner had been there since before she started working, and at first she ignored it. But one night when she was cleaning the floor, her eyes kept drifting toward it. Something about its quiet presence called to her. She told herself she'd just touch one key. Just one. The moment she did, something inside her stirred. That night she played for hours, and when she stopped, there were tears running down her face. She didn't know if they were from sadness or relief, but from that day on, it became her secret routine. Every night after everyone left, she played. Sometimes she'd compose little pieces of her own. She never wrote them down. She played from memory, letting her feelings guide her hands. Other nights she replayed her mother's favorite songs, closing her eyes and pretending she was sitting beside her again. No one in town knew about her secret. Her co-workers often teased her for staying late, thinking she liked to clean slowly or was waiting for someone to walk her home. She just smiled and said she didn't mind the quiet. In truth, those late hours were the only part of her day that felt truly hers. The cafe owner, an older man named Tom, sometimes arrived early in the morning and noticed that the piano keys felt slightly warm, as if someone had been playing not long before. He'd shrug and tell himself it was just the heater. He never imagined his shy employee was behind it. There was something different about Lena's music. It didn't sound like songs people played to show skill or technique. It sounded like feelings, raw, unpolished, and real. It carried the warmth of love and the ache of loss. Anyone who might have heard it would have felt it deeply, but no one ever stayed late enough to listen. One night, as rain poured outside and thunder rolled in the distance, Lena played one of her most personal melodies. It was slow and fragile, a piece she had created after visiting her mother's grave. Her fingers trembled as she played, but the sound that came out was pure and gentle. The rain outside seemed to keep time with her rhythm, like nature itself was listening. She didn't know that music could heal her, little by little. Every time she played, she felt lighter, as though the weight she carried in her heart softened. Sometimes she would whisper softly to herself while playing, "You'd like this one, Mom." It was her way of keeping a part of her mother alive. Despite how much she loved it, she never imagined showing her talent to anyone. The thought of performing in front of people made her anxious. The stage lights, the silence of the crowd waiting. It was too much. She had seen other musicians play confidently in public, but she didn't think she belonged among them. Her music wasn't meant for fame. It was meant for herself and maybe for one person who wasn't there anymore. Her life continued quietly like that for months. Each day looked almost the same. Mornings started with the smell of coffee beans and the soft chatter of customers. Evenings ended with music echoing through an empty cafe. But even in this simple routine, there was a quiet beauty. The music gave her peace. It reminded her that even in ordinary places, something extraordinary could live quietly. Sometimes she wondered what her life might have been if she hadn't given up on music years ago. She imagined herself studying at a music school, maybe playing in small concerts, but those thoughts usually faded quickly. "That's not for me anymore," she would whisper. She had convinced herself that her time for dreams had passed. Still, there were moments when her music seemed to reach out for something more, like a voice trapped behind a closed door, waiting to be heard. That night, after finishing her last piece, she closed the piano lid gently and leaned against it. Her reflection stared back at her in the dark window. The cafe looked peaceful, but inside her, there was a quiet storm, a longing to share what she felt but not knowing how. She brushed it aside, packed her bag, and turned off the lights. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air was fresh, carrying the smell of wet pavement. As she walked home through the empty streets, she hummed softly, the same melody she had played moments ago. What she didn't know was that soon, everything was about to change. Life has a strange way of finding people who try to hide their gifts. Sometimes the right listener comes along at the most unexpected time. The next evening, the cafe was busier than usual. A storm had been forecast again, and many people stopped in for warmth. Lena moved from table to table, serving drinks, smiling politely, and taking orders. She didn't notice the man sitting quietly near the corner window, tapping his fingers to an invisible rhythm. He looked like any other customer, a little older, dressed neatly with a thoughtful expression. When the last few customers left, the man remained, pretending to be lost in his notebook. Lena hesitated for a moment. It was late, and she usually played only when she was sure the place was empty. But tonight something in her chest felt heavy. She needed to play. She turned off most of the lights, leaving just a warm glow near the piano. Thinking she was alone, she sat down and started to play again, the same piece she had written during that rainy night weeks ago. The man stopped writing. His eyes lifted slowly toward her, completely drawn in by the sound. The melody rose and fell like a heartbeat. It wasn't perfect. A few keys were slightly out of tune, but the emotion behind each note was undeniable. The man listened, completely still, afraid that even a breath might disturb the moment. He didn't just hear music. He heard a story, one told through sound, not words. When Lena finished, she sighed softly and closed her eyes for a moment before realizing someone was still there. Her heart jumped. The man smiled, but he didn't clap or say anything loud. He simply said in a soft voice, "That was beautiful." Lena froze, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was here," she said quietly. He shook his head. "Don't apologize. That was the most honest music I've heard in a long time." He didn't stay long after that, just left his card on the counter and said, "If you ever want to share your gift, call me." Lena picked up the card after he left. It had his name and a company logo she didn't recognize. She didn't know that this small moment, a stranger caught in her secret world, would become the start of something much bigger. That night, as she walked home under the streetlights, she kept glancing at the card in her hand. She didn't know what to think. Part of her wanted to forget it ever happened. Another part, the one that still dreamed quietly, wondered if it was finally time to be heard. Lena couldn't stop thinking about that night. Even though she tried to push it out of her mind, the image of the man sitting by the window, quietly listening to her play, kept coming back. She remembered his calm expression, how he didn't interrupt, how his eyes seemed to understand every note. The card he left behind was still in her bag. She had looked at it a few times but hadn't called. It simply said his name, a phone number, and a small logo of a music company she didn't recognize. It didn't feel real. People like him belonged to a different world, a world of bright stages, audiences, and confidence. Lena didn't belong there. She was just a cafe worker who played music in secret after hours. Still, every time she opened her bag, that card seemed to stare at her. Days turned into weeks. The cafe stayed busy and she tried to focus on work. The man never came back and part of her was relieved, but another part of her felt a quiet sadness, as if something unfinished lingered in the air. One rainy afternoon, while she was cleaning tables, her coworker asked, "Hey, you play the piano, right? I came by late the other night and I swear I heard music." Lena froze for a moment, her heart racing. "Oh, I was just pressing a few keys," she said quickly. Her coworker smiled. "You're good. You should play when the cafe's open. People would love it." Lena laughed it off, but the idea made her uncomfortable. She didn't play to be noticed. She played to breathe. Later that evening, when everyone had gone home, she sat at the piano again. Her fingers touched the keys softly, and she began to play without thinking. The music came out different that night, more restless, almost questioning. She didn't realize it, but her emotions were changing. A small part of her wanted to see what would happen if she took a step forward. When she finished, she picked up the card again. She turned it over and over in her hand. The name printed on it felt almost unreal, like something from another life. Finally, she placed it back on the piano and whispered, "Maybe another day." But another day came sooner than she expected. The following week, she received an email through the cafe's contact page. It was short and simple. "Hi Lena, this is the man you met a few weeks ago at the cafe. I hope you're doing well. I've been thinking about your music. There's a charity concert happening next month, and I believe your performance would touch a lot of hearts. If you're open to it, I'd love for you to play one piece. No pressure, just think about it." Lena read it 3 times before it sank in. Her hands started shaking a little. She had never told him her full name, so he must have found out through the cafe's website. She didn't know what to feel. Part of her was touched that he remembered her. Another part was terrified. The idea of performing in front of people after all these years made her stomach twist. What if she made a mistake? What if people didn't feel anything? What if they laughed? That night she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing her mother's voice in her memory. Gentle, calm, always encouraging. "Music isn't about perfection," her mother used to say. "It's about feeling." She got up from bed and sat by the window, listening to the wind outside. Maybe this was her chance to do something brave, something her mother would have been proud of. The next morning, she replied to the email with just 2 words. "I'll try." The man responded almost immediately. He said he'd send her the details soon, and that the concert wasn't formal. It was a small event to raise funds for a children's center. "You don't have to be perfect," he wrote. "Just play what's in your heart." Even reading that made her nervous. But for the first time in years, she felt a spark, something alive inside her. Over the next few weeks, she began practicing seriously. Every night after work, she stayed in the cafe longer than usual. She'd close her eyes and play the same melody over and over, adjusting small parts, feeling the rhythm, trying to find the right story in her music. She didn't tell anyone what she was preparing for. It was her secret project, something that belonged only to her. She decided not to choose a famous song. Instead, she would play her own composition, the one she had written for her mother. It was personal, raw, and emotional. It was the kind of music that didn't just speak, it confessed. As the concert day got closer, she started to doubt herself again. One evening, she stopped mid-song and whispered, "What am I doing? I'm not good enough for this." She pressed her hands against her face, feeling the warmth of her own tears. Then she remembered the man's words. Your music speaks in a way words never could. Maybe she didn't need to be perfect. Maybe she just needed to be honest. The day before the concert, she went to the park to clear her mind. The air was cool and children were playing in the distance. She sat on a bench listening to the rustle of the trees. She thought about how life had changed since the day she met that stranger. It felt strange, how one small moment could shift the course of everything. When she returned to the cafe that night, she sat at the piano for what she thought might be the last time in that quiet space. She touched the keys slowly and whispered, "Thank you." Then she began to play the full piece she planned to perform. It started softly, almost like a whisper, a memory of her mother's laughter hidden in the melody. Then it grew deeper, fuller, carrying her sadness, her hope, and all the nights she had spent playing alone. It wasn't about showing off. It was about telling her story without words. By the time she reached the final note, tears rolled down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall freely. It felt right. The next morning, she woke up early. The concert was being held in a small theater in the city. She packed her things, tied her hair neatly, and took the bus. The ride felt long, and she watched the world outside the window. Streets, people, lives moving quickly. Everything looked bigger and louder than her quiet cafe world. When she arrived, the man was already waiting near the entrance. He greeted her with a warm smile. "I'm glad you came," he said. Lena nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I almost didn't," he smiled again. That's usually how the best stories begin. Inside, she saw other performers preparing, singers, dancers, and musicians chatting cheerfully. She felt completely out of place. But when she sat at the piano to test the keys, something changed. The moment her fingers touched the instrument, her anxiety softened. This was where she belonged. As she practiced quietly, a few people stopped to listen. They didn't say anything, but she noticed how they stood still, almost holding their breath. It reminded her of that first night in the cafe, the silence after her song. When the rehearsal ended, the man approached her again. "Don't overthink it," he said gently. "Play like you're back in your cafe, just you and the piano." She smiled faintly. "That's the only way I know how to play." That night she couldn't sleep much. She kept hearing the melody in her head. Her nerves kept her awake, but underneath the fear was something else, excitement. It had been a long time since she felt something this strong. The next morning, as the concert day arrived, the city glowed under the sunlight. She stood backstage, holding her hands together to stop them from trembling. She could hear the muffled sound of the audience finding their seats. She peeked through the curtain. There were more people than she expected. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might not be able to breathe. The man found her backstage and said quietly, "You don't have to impress anyone. Just tell your story." She nodded, tears already building up in her eyes. She wasn't sure if they were from fear or gratitude. As her turn drew closer, she closed her eyes and whispered, "This is for you, Mom." Then she took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The lights washing over her like morning sunlight. The piano waited in the center, shining softly under the spotlight. For a moment, the room felt too big, too silent. But when she sat down and placed her hands on the keys, everything else disappeared. Her story was about to begin, one told not through words, but through sound. The lights were soft, but to Lena they felt blinding. The stage stretched wide before her, and the audience looked like a sea of quiet faces. She could hear her heartbeat louder than anything else. For a moment she wanted to turn back, to walk off stage and forget all of this. But then she looked at the piano standing there waiting for her, the same way the one in the cafe always waited. Somehow that comforted her. She took a deep breath and sat down. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the small microphone that had been placed near the keys. The air in the hall was heavy with silence. No one moved. It was as if everyone was waiting for her to speak, even though she had no words to say. She closed her eyes. The first note came out soft, almost a whisper. Then another followed, and another. Slowly, the room began to fill with the sound of her heart. The melody rose and fell like waves. At first her hands moved cautiously, almost shy. But as the music began to grow, something inside her shifted. She forgot about the lights, the audience, the fear. All she could feel was the story she wanted to tell. The years of silence, the pain of losing her mother, the quiet strength that carried her through. Every note seemed to speak. There were no lyrics, but the message was clear. The music told of loneliness, love, and the kind of hope that survives even in the darkest moments. The audience sat completely still. A few people closed their eyes. Some leaned forward as if afraid to miss a single sound. The man who had invited her stood near the side of the stage, watching quietly, his eyes shining with pride. Halfway through, Lena's fingers began to move faster. The melody deepened, filled with emotion that came from places she couldn't describe. The sound of the piano echoed off the walls, filling every corner of the hall. The notes weren't perfect. One or two slipped slightly out of rhythm, but that made it even more real. It wasn't a performance. It was a confession. As she played, memories came flooding back. Her mother's soft laughter when she was a child. The smell of their small kitchen on Sunday mornings. The first time she ever touched a piano key. The day everything changed when her mother was gone. The silence that followed for years. All those moments lived inside the song now. Each note carried a piece of her story. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't stop playing. The sound seemed to carry her away, as if the piano had taken control and was guiding her through everything she had ever felt. When she reached the final part, the melody turned gentle again, soft like a goodbye that didn't hurt anymore. It was peaceful, almost like a prayer. She let her hands rest on the last chord, holding it until it faded into silence. The room stayed still. For a long moment, no one clapped. No one spoke. The silence was full and heavy, yet beautiful. Then, one by one, people began to rise to their feet. The applause started softly, then grew until it filled the entire hall. Lena sat frozen, overwhelmed. She had never expected this. Tears rolled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She stood, gave a small bow, and the crowd cheered louder. It wasn't the kind of applause that came from being impressed. It came from being moved. As she stepped off stage, her legs felt weak. The man was waiting for her backstage. He didn't say much, he simply smiled and said, "That was real. And that's what people remember." Lena nodded, still too emotional to speak. She sat down on a nearby chair, her hands still trembling slightly. She could still feel the vibration of the piano keys on her fingertips. Other performers came by to congratulate her, telling her how beautiful her piece was. Some said it made them cry. One older woman took her hand and whispered, "Thank you for reminding me what feeling sounds like." For Lena, those words meant more than anything. Later that night, when the concert ended and people began to leave, she found herself standing on the empty stage again. The lights were dim now and the chairs were mostly empty. She sat down at the piano once more and played a few soft notes. Not a full song, just enough to say goodbye to this moment. It felt like she was closing one chapter and opening another. When she left the theater, the man walked beside her. The streets were quiet, and a cool breeze brushed against their faces. "You did something brave tonight," he said. She smiled faintly. It didn't feel brave. It just felt necessary, he nodded. That's what real art is. It's not about being perfect. It's about being honest. She didn't answer right away. Her mind was still full of everything that had happened. The sound of applause, the faces in the audience, the feeling of finally being seen. "Do you know what I think?" he said after a moment. "You've been hiding your light for too long. The world needs what you have." Lena looked down, unsure how to respond. "I'm not sure the world needs me," she said softly. He smiled gently. "Maybe not the whole world, but someone out there does." Those words stayed with her long after they said goodbye that night. When she got home, she took off her shoes, sat by the window, and looked at the sky. The city lights were glowing faintly in the distance. For the first time in years, she felt a quiet kind of joy. Not loud or dramatic, just real. She picked up her small notebook, one she rarely used, and began to write. She didn't write music, but words this time. How she felt. What the night meant to her. How she realized that her music wasn't something to hide. It was meant to connect. Over the next few days, things began to change slowly. People from the concert reached out to her. Some sent messages saying how deeply her performance had touched them. A short video of her playing had been recorded and shared online. Within days, it had thousands of views. Comments poured in from strangers who said her music made them cry, helped them heal, or reminded them of someone they had lost. Lena couldn't believe it. She had always thought her music was too personal, too quiet for the world. But somehow, people everywhere had understood it. Maybe because feelings were universal. Maybe because honesty always finds a way to reach hearts. Still, she didn't let it go to her head. She continued her simple life. She still worked at the cafe, still wiped tables, and smiled at customers. But now people started coming in asking, "Are you the pianist from the video?" It felt strange hearing that. She would blush, nod politely, and quickly change the topic. But deep down, she felt proud. Not of being noticed, but of having the courage to share her truth. One evening, after closing, she sat again at the cafe piano. The familiar quiet surrounded her. She started to play, and this time her music sounded different. It was lighter, more hopeful. It wasn't about loss anymore. It was about beginning again. She thought about how much her life had changed in such a short time, from being the hidden pianist who played in secret, to standing on a stage, to people around the world hearing her song. But more than all of that, she thought about her mother. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I hope you heard me." The night outside was peaceful. The moonlight spilled through the windows. touching the piano keys with a silver glow. That was when she realized something important. Her mother's lessons hadn't just been about music. They were about life, about courage, about the beauty of feeling deeply even when it hurts, and about sharing that feeling with others. The applause from the concert had faded, the lights were gone, but something inside her had awakened, something that wouldn't go quiet again. As she finished her song, she smiled softly to herself. For years, she had thought her music was meant to be kept hidden. Now she understood it was meant to be shared, not for fame, but for connection, because music, like love, only truly lives when it's given away. The morning after her performance, Lena woke up earlier than usual. The sunlight filtered softly through her small apartment window. For a while, she just sat on her bed, still trying to process everything that had happened. It almost didn't feel real. The concert, the applause, the way strangers had come up to her afterward with tears in their eyes. She picked up her phone and saw a flood of messages. The video from the concert had spread faster than she expected. People she had never met were sharing it with kind words and emotional comments. Some said her music reminded them of someone they loved. Others said it helped them through a difficult time. Lena didn't know what to do with all of it. She wasn't used to being seen. For so long she had lived quietly, almost invisible, blending into the background. Now people were noticing her, not just as a cafe worker, but as someone who had something meaningful to share. She went to work as usual that day, tying her apron and stepping behind the counter. The cafe smelled like freshly ground coffee and warm bread, just like always. But there was something different in the air. When her co-workers saw her, they started clapping playfully. "Look who's famous now," one of them said with a grin. Lena blushed and waved her hands. "Please, I'm not famous," she said, laughing nervously. But throughout the day, people came in asking about her. A few customers even requested that she play while they had their coffee. She politely declined at first, saying she didn't perform at work. But later that evening, when the crowd thinned and the light outside softened, she changed her mind. She sat down at the piano, the same one she had played on so many lonely nights, and began to play a simple melody. The cafe fell quiet almost instantly. Even the sound of spoons stirring in cups stopped. The notes filled the room gently, wrapping everyone in a calm, familiar warmth. When she finished, there was a soft round of applause. A few people smiled at her with tears in their eyes. One woman whispered, "That was beautiful." It was a small moment, but it meant everything to Lena. For the first time, she wasn't hiding. In the days that followed, the cafe began to feel different. People came not just for coffee, but to hear her play in the evenings. Some would sit quietly near the piano, eyes closed, just listening. Others would ask her questions about her music, how she started, what inspired her songs. Lena was still shy about attention, but she answered with honesty. She told them that her music came from feelings she couldn't put into words. She said she played to remember, to heal, and to feel alive. And people connected with that. Soon, the man who had first discovered her stopped by the cafe again. He smiled when he saw the small crowd gathered around her. "I knew this would happen," he said. "Your music belongs with people." Lena smiled a little shyly. "I never thought anyone would care to listen." "They don't just listen," he said softly. "They feel it. That's the difference." He invited her to perform again, this time at a community center event. It wasn't a big stage like before, but the idea made her nervous again. Yet something inside her had changed. She didn't want to hide anymore, so she agreed. The event was small, filled with people from different walks of life, children, parents, older folks. When she sat down to play, she looked around and saw faces that reminded her of ordinary life. She realized that her music didn't need to be grand or perfect. It just needed to be honest. That evening she played 3 pieces, one joyful, one calm, and one full of longing. The audience clapped after each one, not just politely, but warmly. Afterward, a little girl came up to her holding a drawing of a piano. "I want to learn to play like you," the girl said softly. Lena bent down and smiled. "You will. Just play from your heart." Those words stayed with her long after the event ended. On her way home, she thought about her own childhood, how her mother had taught her with patience and love, how those moments had shaped her. Maybe now it was her turn to pass that on. A few weeks later, she started giving small piano lessons to children in her neighborhood. At first, she didn't charge anything. She just wanted to share the joy of music. The kids loved it. Her small living room soon filled with laughter, clumsy notes, and little fingers learning to find the right keys. Teaching brought something new into her life. She realized that her story wasn't just about finding her voice. It was about helping others find theirs too. Every time she saw a child's face light up when they finally played a full song, she felt a deep happiness that no applause could match. Word spread slowly, and more people came to learn from her. Parents told her how their children had become calmer and happier after learning music. Some adults even asked for lessons themselves. Lena never saw herself as a professional teacher or performer. She still worked at the cafe, still enjoyed the quiet moments after closing time. But now her life had more meaning. Her days were filled with sound, not just her own, but the music of others learning to express themselves. One evening, after a long day of work and teaching, she sat at the cafe piano once more. She played softly, just for herself. As she played, she noticed an elderly man sitting alone near the window. He was listening quietly, eyes closed, his coffee untouched. When she finished, he walked up to her. "I lost my wife last year," he said gently. "Tonight was the first time I've felt peace since then." "Thank you." Lena's eyes softened. "I'm glad the music helped," she said quietly. He smiled. "It did more than help. It reminded me that I'm still alive." After he left, Lena sat there for a while thinking. It amazed her how sound, just simple notes, could reach people in such deep ways. She realized that maybe that was what she was meant to do all along. Not to be famous. Not to be rich. Just to connect hearts through sound. The man who had once discovered her became a close friend. He often stopped by to check in, offering small opportunities for her to play at local charity events and gatherings. Each time she accepted with more confidence. She didn't overthink it anymore. She simply played and people listened. Her performances were never about showing off skill. They were about honesty. Her audiences grew, but her music remained as personal as the first song she ever played alone in the cafe. One night, after another small concert, she stood outside looking at the city lights. The man stood beside her and said, "You've come a long way." Lena smiled. "It still feels like I'm just beginning." He looked at her thoughtfully. "That's how you know you're doing something right." She looked up at the sky, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. The air was cool, and the city hummed softly in the background. For the first time, she felt at peace with herself, with her past, her pain, and her path forward. In her heart, she knew she would never stop playing. It wasn't just about the piano anymore. It was about everything it represented. Love, healing, courage, and truth. As she walked home that night, she passed by the park she often visited before the concert months ago. She stopped for a moment and sat on the same bench. The trees rustled softly in the breeze, and she smiled to herself. She remembered how scared she had been, how much she doubted her own worth. And yet here she was now, living proof that even the quietest voices can reach the world when spoken with sincerity. Her life wasn't glamorous or filled with fame, but it was full of meaning, and that mattered more than anything. When she reached her apartment, she placed her hands on her piano, the one she had saved for years to buy secondhand. It had scratches and worn keys, but she loved it deeply. She sat down and began to play once again. The sound filled the small space warmly, like a familiar friend. This time, her song was different. It wasn't about loss or sadness. It was about gratitude. For the people who had listened, for the courage she had found, and for the music that had carried her through every storm. She smiled through her tears as she played, realizing how far she had come. And though she didn't know what tomorrow would bring, she knew one thing for sure. She would keep playing, not for the world, but for the hearts that still needed to hear her story. And somewhere, she liked to believe her mother was listening too. Months passed, and life quietly settled into a new rhythm for Lena. The cafe still buzzed with laughter and chatter. The piano still stood by the window, and her students still came every week with excitement and clumsy fingers. But something inside her had changed. She had grown, not just as a musician, but as a person who finally understood her purpose. Each morning she woke up early, opened the curtains, and let the sunlight fill her small apartment. The same light that once reminded her of loneliness now brought her comfort. She had found a life that made sense, simple, peaceful, filled with meaning. Still, her heart often wandered back to that night, the first time she played on stage. The memory never faded. It wasn't about the applause or the crowd. It was about the feeling, that moment when her music connected to people's hearts, when words weren't needed to explain anything. She missed that feeling sometimes. One afternoon, as she was finishing a lesson, her phone buzzed. It was an email from a music foundation in another city. They had seen one of her performances online and wanted to invite her to play at a charity event that supported young artists from humble backgrounds. Lena read the message twice. It felt almost unbelievable. The event wasn't fancy or commercial. It was about stories like hers, quiet people who had found courage through art. For a moment she hesitated. Traveling to another city felt big, especially for someone who still doubted herself sometimes. But then she remembered what she always told her students. If something scares you, it means it matters. So she accepted. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. She practiced after work, late into the night. She didn't pick her most complicated songs. Instead, she chose 3 simple ones, each with a story behind it. One was about loss, one about hope, and one about gratitude. The day of the event arrived, and Lena took the early morning train. The ride was quiet, the world outside moving slowly past the window. She watched the trees and buildings blur together, her heart beating steadily with both excitement and fear. When she reached the venue, she was greeted warmly by the organizers. The hall was smaller than the one where she first performed, but there was something intimate about it. The lights were soft, the stage was simple, and the piano stood at the center, waiting for her. Before the show began, she sat backstage, her hands resting on her lap. She could hear the low murmur of the audience outside. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, remembering why she was there. Not to impress, not to prove anything, but to share something real. When it was her turn, she walked onto the stage. The audience was quiet, expectant. She bowed slightly and sat down at the piano. For a few seconds, she just looked at the keys, her reflection faintly visible in the glossy surface. Then she began to play. The first song was soft, gentle, almost fragile. It spoke of longing, of all the things left unsaid in life. The notes floated through the hall like whispers. Some people closed their eyes, others leaned forward, caught in the tenderness of her playing. The second song carried a brighter tone. It was about finding light again after darkness. Each note felt like a small step forward, steady and hopeful. By the time she finished, the audience was completely still, absorbed in the quiet beauty of the moment. And then came the last song, her most personal one. It began slowly, with a melody that sounded almost like a voice speaking softly. As it built up, it became clear that the song carried her story, all her years of silent struggle and rediscovery. Every emotion she had ever felt seemed to live in those notes. As the final chord faded into silence, Lena lifted her hands from the keys. The hall stayed quiet for a heartbeat, then filled with applause. It wasn't loud or wild, but full of warmth. She stood and bowed, feeling tears prick her eyes. It wasn't just applause she was hearing, it was understanding. People weren't clapping for perfection. They were clapping because they felt something real. After the performance, many came to speak with her. A mother thanked her for inspiring her daughter to learn music again. A young man said her last song made him think of his late father. An older woman simply hugged her, whispering, "Thank you for that moment." That night, back in her small hotel room, Lena sat by the window and watched the city lights. She didn't feel tired. She felt peaceful. For the first time, she realized that her music had grown beyond her. It was now part of others, part of their memories, their emotions, their healing. The next morning, she returned home to her quiet apartment. The first thing she did was walk over to her piano. She touched the keys gently, almost like greeting an old friend. Days went by, then weeks. Life continued, but something beautiful kept unfolding. More people started reaching out to her online. Schools and community centers invited her to speak and perform. They wanted her to share not just her music, but her journey, how she had gone from a quiet cafe player to someone whose melodies touched so many hearts. At first, she wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't used to talking about herself, but as she began telling her story, The truth about her fears, her failures, and the long nights when she wanted to give up. She noticed something. People didn't see her as a performer on a pedestal.